The acrid smell of freshly turned earth filled the air as Detective Kate Reeves stood at the edge of the expansive backyard, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. The once immaculate lawn of the Blackstone estate, a symbol of wealth and prestige in the affluent suburbs of Boston, was now a patchwork of muddy holes and mounds of dirt. Crime scene technicians in white suits moved methodically across the property, their tools probing the earth for secrets long buried. Kate's partner, Detective Mike Holloway, approached, his face grim. "You're not going to believe this, Kate," he said, his voice low. "We've found parts, human remains." Kate's breath caught in her throat. After weeks of investigation, months of whispers and suspicions, they had finally found something concrete. But nothing could have prepared her for what Mike said next. "There's more," he continued, his eyes meeting hers. "Based on the initial assessment, we're looking at multiple body parts, all from the same victim. And given the location..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what this meant. The Blackstone estate, home to one of Boston's most prominent families, was now a crime scene. And the prime suspect was none other than Jonathan Blackstone himself, CEO, philanthropist, and pillar of the community. As Kate surveyed the scene, her mind raced with the implications. How had it come to this? How had a man like Jonathan Blackstone, with everything to lose, been driven to commit such a horrific act? Little did she know, the answers to these questions would lead her down a dark path, unraveling a tale of shame, betrayal, and a father's ultimate betrayal of his child. The story that was about to unfold would shock the nation, challenging perceptions of family, identity, and the lengths to which a person might go to protect their legacy. As the sun began to set over the Blackstone estate, casting long shadows across the ruined lawn, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that this case would change everything. Not just for the Blackstones, but for her, for Boston, and for a society forced to confront its deepest prejudices. She had no way of knowing just how right she was. To understand the tragedy that befell the Blackstone family, one must first understand the world they inhabited, a world of old money, influence, and carefully guarded reputations. The Blackstones were Boston royalty, their lineage tracing back to the city's founding fathers. For generations, they had been at the forefront of politics, business, and philanthropy, their names synonymous with power and prestige. At the head of this dynasty stood Jonathan Blackstone, a man whose very presence commanded respect and admiration. At 55, Jonathan was the epitome of success, tall, distinguished, with piercing blue eyes and a full head of silver hair that only added to his aura of authority. Jonathan wasn't just wealthy, recalled James Sullivan, a longtime business associate. He had the kind of influence that money can't buy. When he spoke, people listened. When he wanted something done, it happened. He was like a force of nature. As CEO of Blackstone Enterprises, a multinational corporation with interests in everything from real estate to cutting-edge technology, Jonathan had taken his family's fortune and multiplied it tenfold. His business acumen was legendary, his philanthropic efforts widely praised. The Blackstone Foundation donated millions each year to causes ranging from education to medical research. But for all his public accomplishments, it was in his private life that Jonathan took the most pride. He had married his college sweetheart, Elizabeth, a woman whose grace and charm made her the perfect counterpart to Jonathan's power. Together they had 2 children, Michael, the eldest, who at 28 was being groomed to take over the family business, and Samantha, their youngest, at 24. They were the perfect family, said Margaret Whitman, a prominent figure in Boston's social scene. Jonathan and Elizabeth were so in love, even after all these years. And those kids, so accomplished, so polite, it was like they stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Michael, in particular, seemed to be following closely in his father's footsteps. Tall and handsome, with his father's commanding presence, he had graduated top of his class from Harvard Business School and was already making waves in the corporate world. Samantha, on the other hand, had always been something of an enigma. Quieter and more reserved than her brother, she had chosen to pursue a degree in social work rather than business, a decision that had initially puzzled many in their social circle. Sam was different, recalled her college roommate, Jessica Chen. Not in a bad way, you know. She just never seemed comfortable in the spotlight like the rest of her family. There was always something she was holding back. What Jessica and the rest of the world didn't know was the truth that Samantha had been struggling with for years, a truth that would ultimately tear the Blackstone family apart and lead to unimaginable tragedy. Because Samantha Blackstone had a secret that, in the world she inhabited, felt like a ticking time bomb. From a young age, Samantha had known that she was different. While her body was male, her heart and mind had always known she was a woman. She was transgender, trapped in a life and a body that felt alien to her. For years, Samantha, known to the world as Samuel, had hidden this truth, terrified of the consequences of revealing her true self. She had watched as her father railed against political correctness gone mad and the erosion of traditional values. She had seen the disgust in his eyes when news stories about transgender rights came on TV. "I can't imagine what goes through the minds of these people," Jonathan had once said over dinner, his voice dripping with disdain. "Men wanting to be women, women wanting to be men. It's unnatural, a perversion of God's plan." Each word had been like a knife in Samantha's heart, deepening her fear and her shame. But as she grew older, the pain of living a lie became unbearable. During her college years, away from the watchful eyes of her family, Samantha had begun to explore her true identity. She had found a supportive community, begun therapy, and had even started taking hormones. But she knew that eventually she would have to face her family. She would have to tell them the truth, no matter the consequences. What Samantha couldn't have known was just how high those consequences would be. She couldn't have imagined that her quest for authenticity would lead to a chain of events that would end in violence, death, and the destruction of everything the Blackstone family had built. As the summer of 2023 approached, Samantha made the decision that would change everything. She would come out to her family. She would finally live as her true self. Little did she know, her courage would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy, exposing the dark underbelly of a family that had seemed, on the surface, to be the very picture of perfection. The day Samantha Blackstone decided to reveal her truth to her family started like any other in the Blackstone household. Jonathan was in his study poring over quarterly reports. Elizabeth was planning a charity gala. Michael was on a business trip to New York. Samantha stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, her heart pounding. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a simple blouse and skirt, nothing too flashy. Her hair, which she had been growing out for months, was styled in a feminine cut. For the first time in her life, she saw herself, the real Samantha, looking back at her. Taking a deep breath, she made her way downstairs. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice shaking slightly. "Can we talk? It's important." The family gathered in the living room, confusion evident on Jonathan and Elizabeth's faces. Samantha had asked Michael to join via video call, knowing she wanted her entire family present for this moment. "What's this about, son?" Jonathan asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything all right?" Samantha flinched at the word son, but steeled herself. This was it. There was no turning back now. I have something to tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've known for a long time, but I've been too afraid to say." And then, with tears in her eyes, Samantha told her family the truth. She explained how she had always felt different, how living as a man had been suffocating her true self. She told them about the therapy, the hormones, her plans for the future. "I'm a woman," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "My name is Samantha, and I hope you can accept me for who I really am." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Michael, on the screen, looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing without sound. But it was Jonathan's reaction that Samantha would remember for the rest of her life. His face, usually so controlled, contorted with a rage she had never seen before. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Samantha took a step back, fear coursing through her veins. "Dad, please, try to understand." "Understand?" Jonathan roared, surging to his feet. "Understand that my son is some kind of freak that he wants to parade around in dresses and makeup? Do you have any idea what this will do to our family, to our reputation? Jonathan, please, Elizabeth interjected, reaching for her husband's arm. But Jonathan shook her off, his eyes never leaving Samantha. You will not do this, he said, his voice shaking with fury. I forbid it. You will stop this nonsense immediately. No more therapy, no more drugs. You are Samuel Blackstone, my son, and that is who you will remain. Samantha felt her heart breaking, but she stood her ground. I'm sorry, Dad, she said softly, but I can't live a lie anymore. This is who I am. Jonathan's face went pale, then flushed with anger. Then you are no longer my child, he spat. Get out of my house. You are dead to me. Dad, no! Michael's voice came through the speakers, filled with shock and dismay. You can't mean that. But Jonathan was already storming out of the room, slamming the door behind him with such force that the windows rattled. Elizabeth, tears streaming down her face, pulled Samantha into a tight embrace. Oh, my darling, she whispered. I'm so sorry. We'll figure this out. Your father just needs time. But as Samantha clung to her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had broken in her family. The look in her father's eyes, it wasn't just anger or disappointment. It was something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. Little did she know, that moment of revelation would set in motion a chain of events that would end in unimaginable tragedy. The Blackstone family's perfect facade had cracked, and through that crack, a darkness would seep that would consume them all. In the weeks following Samantha's revelation, the Blackstone household became a battleground of tension and unspoken hostilities. Jonathan refused to even look at Samantha, treating her as if she were invisible. Elizabeth tried to play peacemaker, but her efforts only seemed to fuel Jonathan's anger. Michael, torn between loyalty to his father and love for his sibling, tried to reason with both sides. Dad, can't you see how much Sam is hurting? He pleaded during one particularly heated argument. This isn't a choice. It's who she is. But Jonathan was unmovable. Don't you dare call him she, he snarled. This is nothing but a phase, a sickness, and I will not have it in my house. As the summer wore on, Samantha found herself increasingly isolated in her own home. She spent most of her time in her room, venturing out only when necessary. The once vibrant young woman became a shadow, her eyes constantly red-rimmed from crying. It was Elizabeth who finally convinced Jonathan to allow Samantha to stay, arguing that cutting her off completely would only lead to scandal. Think of the business, Jonathan, she urged. If this gets out, how will it look if we've thrown our own child out on the street? Jonathan grudgingly agreed, but his resentment only grew. He began drinking heavily, something he had never done before. His temper, always volatile, became explosive. The staff walked on eggshells, terrified of setting him off. One night, after a particularly nasty confrontation with Samantha, Jonathan stormed into his study and locked the door. Elizabeth, worried, pressed her ear to the wood. I can't let this happen, she heard him mutter. I won't let him destroy everything we've built. There has to be a way to fix this. If Elizabeth had known then what those words truly meant, perhaps the tragedy that followed could have been averted. But she, like everyone else, underestimated the depths of Jonathan's obsession with his legacy and his inability to accept what he saw as a threat to everything he held dear. As July turned to August, tensions in the Blackstone house reached a boiling point. Samantha, emboldened by support from Michael and her mother, began to dress more openly as herself. She made plans to legally change her name, to begin the process of transitioning fully. Each step she took towards embracing her true identity seemed to drive Jonathan further into a rage. He became obsessed with the idea that Samantha was doing this to spite him, to ruin the Blackstone name out of some twisted revenge. I've given you everything, he shouted during one confrontation. A life of privilege, the best education money can buy. And this is how you repay me? By turning yourself into a freak? Samantha, her own temper finally snapping, shot back. This isn't about you, Dad. This is about me finally being true to myself. Why can't you understand that? Understand? You want me to understand? Jonathan's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. What I understand is that you're sick, and if you won't let me help you, if you insist on destroying this family, then maybe it would be better if you weren't here at all. The threat hung in the air, chilling in its implication. Samantha fled the room, locking herself in her bedroom. She called Michael, her voice shaking. "I'm scared, Mike," she confessed. "The way Dad looked at me, I've never seen him like this. I think he might actually hurt me." Michael, alarmed, promised to come home immediately. "Just hang on, Sam," he urged. "We'll figure this out. Maybe it's time you moved out, got some space from Dad until he calms down." But even as they made plans, neither of them could have imagined the horrific turn events were about to take. Because Jonathan Blackstone, the man who had built an empire, who had prided himself on his control and his legacy, was spiraling into a darkness from which there would be no return. In his study, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Jonathan Blackstone made a decision. He would not allow his son's delusion to destroy everything he had built. He would not let the Blackstone name be tarnished by scandal and shame. No matter what it took, he would protect his legacy. Even if it meant destroying the very thing he claimed to be protecting, his family. As night fell over the Blackstone estate, a plan began to form in Jonathan's mind. A plan born of desperation, fueled by alcohol and a lifetime of rigid beliefs. A plan that would lead to unimaginable horror and forever change the lives of everyone involved. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the nation and expose the dark underbelly of a family that had seemed on the surface to be the very picture of success and happiness. August 15th dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. In the Blackstone household, the atmosphere was equally charged, the tension that had been building for weeks ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Samantha woke early, her sleep restless and plagued by nightmares. She had made a decision. Today would be the day she would leave. Michael was coming to help her move out, to start a new life away from the suffocating presence of their father. As she packed her belongings, a lifetime of memories condensed into a few suitcases, Samantha felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear of the unknown, of facing the world as her true self without the safety net of her family's wealth and influence, but also excitement at the prospect of finally living authentically, of no longer having to hide who she really was. Downstairs, Jonathan Blackstone sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. He had barely slept, his mind racing with dark thoughts. The idea that had formed in the recesses of his mind days ago had taken root, growing and twisting until it consumed him entirely. He couldn't let Samuel, he refused to think of his son as Samantha, leave. He couldn't risk the scandal, the damage to the Blackstone name. No, he had to take action. He had to protect his legacy, no matter the cost. As the morning wore on, the house fell into an uneasy quiet. Elizabeth had gone out, unable to bear the tension any longer. The staff, sensing the storm brewing, made themselves scarce. It was just after noon when Samantha, having finished packing, made her way downstairs. She planned to wait for Michael in the garden, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She never made it outside. Jonathan intercepted her in the foyer, his eyes bloodshot, his normally impeccable appearance disheveled. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his words slightly slurred. Samantha took a step back, her heart racing. "I'm leaving, Dad," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Michael's coming to help me move out. I think it's best for everyone if I go." Something dark flashed in Jonathan's eyes. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. "You're my son, and you'll stay here until we fix this sickness." "There's nothing to fix," Samantha cried, her frustration and fear boiling over. "This is who I am, Dad. Why can't you accept that?" What happened next would haunt Samantha's nightmares for years to come. With a roar of incoherent rage, Jonathan lunged forward, his hands closing around Samantha's throat. "I'll fix you myself," he snarled, his face contorted with a fury that went beyond reason. Samantha struggled, clawing at her father's hands, trying desperately to break free. But Jonathan was stronger, driven by a madness that gave him an almost superhuman strength. As the edges of her vision began to darken, Samantha's last conscious thought was of regret. Regret that she would never get to live as her true self, that her life would end at the hands of the man who should have loved her unconditionally. And then, everything went black. When Samantha's body went limp in his hands, something in Jonathan Blackstone's mind snapped. The red haze of anger cleared, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. He looked down at his child's still form, and for a brief moment, horror washed over him. But it was quickly replaced by a grim determination. He had done what needed to be done, he told himself. He had protected his family's legacy. Now he just needed to ensure that no one ever found out. With an efficiency that was chilling in its precision, Jonathan began to enact a plan that must have been forming in the darkest recesses of his mind for days. He dragged Samantha's body to the basement, to a room that had once been used for wine storage, but had long since been abandoned. There, using tools from his gardening shed, Jonathan Blackstone committed an act so horrific, so beyond the pale of human decency, that it would shock even the most hardened investigators when it eventually came to light. He dismembered his own child's body. As a summer storm raged outside, Jonathan worked methodically, his mind detached from the gruesome reality of what he was doing. He wrapped the parts in plastic, then began to dig holes in various locations around the vast Blackstone estate. By the time Michael arrived later that evening, frantic with worry after being unable to reach Samantha, all traces of what had occurred had been erased. Or so Jonathan thought. "Where's Sam?" Michael demanded, his eyes scanning the foyer where, just hours earlier, his sister had breathed her last. "Samuel left," Jonathan said, his voice steady, his appearance once again immaculate. "He said he couldn't bear to face you, to admit that this phase was just a cry for attention. He's gone to stay with friends. I'm sure he'll contact you when he's ready." Michael, confused and hurt, tried to argue, to insist that Samantha would never leave without saying goodbye. But Jonathan's story was convincing, his manner so assured that even Michael began to doubt. As Michael left, promising to try and track Samantha down, Jonathan Blackstone stood in the doorway of his mansion, watching his son drive away. He had done it, he thought. He had protected his legacy. The scandal had been averted. But even as he congratulated himself, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a truth he couldn't yet face. This was only the beginning. The real nightmare was yet to come. The disappearance of Samuel Blackstone, for that was how it was initially reported, sent shockwaves through Boston's elite social circles. How could the scion of one of the city's most prominent families simply vanish without a trace? At first, the story Jonathan had crafted held. Samantha had run away, overcome by the stress of her identity crisis. She would return when she had come to her senses. The Blackstone family asked for privacy during this difficult time. But as days turned into weeks with no word from Samantha, cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed narrative. Michael, initially willing to believe his father's story, grew increasingly suspicious. "It doesn't make sense," he confided to his girlfriend, Sophia. "Sam would never just disappear like this. She was excited about starting her new life. Something's not right." Elizabeth, too, began to question her husband's account. She noticed changes in Jonathan, his increased drinking, his sudden aversion to spending time in the garden he had once loved tending. And there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when she caught a look in his eyes that chilled her to the bone. It was Detective Kate Reeves who first began to seriously investigate the possibility of foul play. Assigned to the case after Michael finally filed a missing persons report, Kate's instincts told her from the beginning that there was more to this story than a rebellious rich kid running away. "The timeline doesn't add up," she told her partner, Mike Holloway, as they pored over the case files. According to the father, Samuel left sometime on the afternoon of August 15th. But we have security camera footage of him entering the estate that morning, and no footage of him leaving. So where did he go? As Kate dug deeper, she began to uncover the truth about Samantha's identity and the tensions it had caused within the Blackstone family. She interviewed friends from college who spoke of Samantha's plans to transition, of her fear of her father's reaction. Sam was terrified of telling her dad. Jessica Chen, Samantha's college roommate, told the detectives. She said he would never understand, that he might do something drastic. The picture that emerged was far from the perfect family the Blackstones had presented to the world. Kate began to focus her investigation on Jonathan, her suspicions growing with each inconsistency she uncovered in his story. But Jonathan Blackstone was a powerful man, with friends in high places. Kate's superiors pressured her to back off, to accept the runaway story and close the case. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that house. It was a groundskeeper, Ramon Suarez, who provided the break in the case. He came to the police station late one night, visibly shaken. "I didn't think much of it at first," he told Kate, his voice trembling. "Mr. Blackstone has always been particular about the gardens, but lately he's been obsessed with certain areas, won't let anyone near them, and sometimes, late at night, I've seen him out there digging." Kate's blood ran cold. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond mere intuition, what they would find in those carefully tended gardens. The search of the Blackstone estate began the next morning. As shovels broke the earth in dozens of locations around the vast property, Kate watched Jonathan Blackstone's facade finally crack. "You'll find nothing," he insisted, his voice rising in pitch. "This is a witch hunt, a violation of our privacy. I'll have your badge for this." But his protests fell on deaf ears, because in a flower bed near the back of the property, under a row of prize-winning roses, they found the first evidence of the horrific truth. A human hand, delicate and pale, with nails painted a soft pink. As the full extent of Jonathan's crimes came to light, as more and more remains were unearthed from the once pristine gardens, the Blackstone family's carefully constructed world came crashing down. Elizabeth collapsed when she heard the news, her anguished cries echoing through the mansion. Michael, his face a mask of shock and grief, could only repeat, "No, no, no," as if by denying it, he could make it untrue. And Jonathan Blackstone, the man who had once commanded boardrooms and bent politicians to his will, crumbled. As he was led away in handcuffs, he seemed to age decades in moments. The proud, powerful man was gone, replaced by a hollow shell, broken by the weight of his own monstrous actions. The arrest of Jonathan Blackstone sent shockwaves through Boston and beyond. The story of a father driven to murder by his own prejudice and obsession with legacy became national news, sparking heated debates about transphobia, family acceptance, and the dark side of wealth and power. For Detective Kate Reeves, the case was both a triumph and a tragedy. They had found the truth, had brought a killer to justice, but the cost had been unimaginably high. As she stood in the ruined gardens of the Blackstone estate, watching as forensics teams continued their grim work, Kate couldn't help but think of Samantha, of the life she had been denied, of the courage it had taken to be true to herself in the face of such opposition. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you," Kate whispered, her words carried away by the warm summer breeze. "But I promise you, your story will be told, your truth will be known." And as the sun set on the Blackstone estate, casting long shadows across the torn-up lawn, Kate made a silent vow. She would see this through to the end. For Samantha, and for all those who had ever suffered for simply being who they were. The Blackstone tragedy had exposed the darkness that could lurk behind even the most polished facades. But in doing so, it had also shone a light on issues long ignored, starting conversations that were long overdue. Samantha Blackstone's life had been cut tragically short, but her death would spark changes that would resonate far beyond the gilded world she had left behind. The trial of Jonathan Blackstone became a media sensation, drawing attention from around the world. The story had all the elements of a tragic Shakespearean play: wealth, power, prejudice, and a father's ultimate betrayal of his child. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Elena Rodriguez, painted a damning picture of Jonathan as a man so obsessed with his legacy and reputation that he was willing to commit the ultimate sin, the murder of his own child. Jonathan Blackstone had everything. Rodriguez told the jury in her opening statement: wealth, power, a loving family. But when faced with a truth he couldn't accept, he chose to destroy rather than understand. He chose hate over love, violence over acceptance. The defense, for their part, tried to paint Jonathan as a man who had suffered a mental break, arguing that the stress of his child's revelation had pushed him into a state of temporary insanity. But their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the calculated way Jonathan had attempted to cover up his crime. Throughout the trial, Michael Blackstone sat in the front row, his face a mask of grief and disbelief. He had lost his entire family in one horrific act, his sister to his father's violence, his father to his own hatred and prejudice. Elizabeth, unable to face the reality of what her husband had done, had retreated into a private mental health facility, leaving Michael to face the public scrutiny alone. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Jessica Chen, Samantha's college roommate, took the stand. Through tears, she read excerpts from Samantha's journal, giving voice to the young woman whose life had been so tragically cut short. "I dream of a day when I can walk in the sun as my true self," Jessica read, her voice shaking with emotion. "When I can look in the mirror and see the woman I know I am. I'm scared of what's to come, of how my family will react, but I know I can't live a lie anymore. I have to be true to myself, no matter the cost." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as Jessica finished reading. Even the most hardened reporters found themselves moved by Samantha's words, by the courage and hope that had defined her short life. Jonathan Blackstone, for his part, sat impassively throughout most of the trial. But as Samantha's words echoed through the courtroom, something in him seemed to break. For the first time, those watching saw a flicker of emotion cross his face. Was it regret, remorse, or simply the realization of the magnitude of what he had done? After weeks of testimony, mountains of forensic evidence, and hours of expert analysis, the case went to the jury. It took them less than a day to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. As the verdict was read, a collective exhale seemed to go through the courtroom. Jonathan Blackstone, once one of the most powerful men in Boston, stood motionless, his face ashen. Michael, in the gallery, buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sentencing hearing, held a week later, was a somber affair. Victim impact statements were read, including a heartbreaking letter from Elizabeth, read by her therapist, in which she struggled to reconcile the man she had loved with the monster he had become. When it came time for Jonathan to speak, the courtroom held its collective breath. Would he show remorse? Try to justify his actions? Beg for mercy? Instead, Jonathan Blackstone stood, straightened his tie, and addressed the court with a calm that was almost chilling. "I did what I thought was necessary to protect my family's legacy," he said, his voice steady. "I couldn't allow my son's confusion to destroy everything we had built. I realize now that I was wrong, not in my beliefs, but in my actions. I should have found another way." A gasp went up from the gallery at these words. Even now, even after everything, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to accept Samantha for who she truly was. The judge, her face a mask of disgust, wasted no time in handing down her sentence. "Jonathan Blackstone, for the murder of your child, Samantha Blackstone, and for the pain and suffering you have caused to countless others, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. May God have mercy on your soul." As Jonathan was led away, Detective Kate Reeves watched from the back of the courtroom. The case had taken its toll on her. Sleepless nights, strained relationships, the weight of Samantha's lost life, heavy on her conscience. But as she saw Jonathan disappear through the door to begin his journey to prison, she felt a glimmer of something like peace. "We got him, Samantha," she murmured to herself. "We got him." 5 years after the trial of Jonathan Blackstone, the scars left by his crimes were still visible in the lives of those he had touched. Michael Blackstone, now the reluctant head of Blackstone Enterprises, had thrown himself into transforming his family's company. Under his leadership, the corporation had become a leader in LGBTQ+ rights, funding scholarships for transgender youth, and partnering with organizations working to combat prejudice and discrimination. "I couldn't save my sister," Michael said in a rare interview, "but I can honor her memory by working to create a world where no one has to fear being who they truly are." Elizabeth Blackstone, having finally emerged from the depths of her depression, had become an advocate for mental health awareness and family acceptance. She spoke openly about her own struggles, about the importance of loving your children unconditionally. "I failed Samantha," she often said, her voice filled with regret. "I didn't stand up for her when she needed me most. I can't change the past, but I can try to make a difference for other families facing similar struggles." Detective Kate Reeves, hailed as a hero for her role in bringing Jonathan to justice, had been promoted to captain. She often used the Blackstone case as a teaching tool for young detectives, a stark reminder of the importance of following your instincts and the reality that monsters can hide behind even the most respectable facades. The Blackstone estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, had been transformed into a shelter for LGBTQ+ youth who had been rejected by their families. The gardens where Samantha's remains had been found were now a memorial, a peaceful place where young people could find acceptance and support. As for Jonathan Blackstone, he remained in prison, his appeals exhausted, his once vast fortune dwindling as lawsuits and repar